Good morning. Thank you for joining the session. I am here to talk about the economic opportunities of generative AI for Europe. And as we were preparing this study, we looked at this graph, and we were very happy to see that the team helping Draghi looked at the same data and essentially asked themselves the same question. So the dip that we saw in Europe in our relative productivity performance vis-a-vis the US during the last wave of technology related to the internet economy from the mid-90s, will that step down in relative performance repeat itself as we look into the coming era of potentially the most powerful wave of technology that I have seen in my lifetime? So that's the big question that we asked ourselves. And in addressing that question, we turned to some research that was done by the Goldman Sachs investment bank in the US, who looked deeply into the likely speed of adoption of generative AI across all economies across the globe. And from a realization that the commercial breakthroughs that happened in 2022 moved forward the curve of what is possible with technology, and meaning that economists would need to reset their long-term growth projections to incorporate the potential effects of generative AI into the forecast of economic growth. So what we did was taking the details of that and applying it in a European setting. And the good thing about the adoption part of using new technology, as distinguished from the creation part of it, is that it's still early days. It's way down here below the seats. But as you can see, the curve is actually a sort of an S curve that takes off really slowly. But then as it picks up, the adoption of technology is likely to follow a curve that is similar to that. And we are already only in the beginning of this, meaning that the window is still open for Europe to catch up in terms of the minor lag that we have vis-a-vis the US, in terms of adopting and making the technology useful to drive productivity, to free up labor in areas where we are seeing increasing labor shortages in Europe. So what we did was actually looking at this curve, and the point that on this curve that you need to be particularly interested about is in the middle. That's where the speed of adoption is actually peaking. So the moment we look at is at the point that if Europe achieves widespread adoption roughly at the speed of the expected adoption curve, then what would be the impact on our economy in around 10 years from now, when the global impact from generative AI is expected to peak globally? And you may recall having seen a number saying, generative AI can add around 7% to global GDP. That was the sort of the blockbuster number that came out of Goldman Sachs. We did the same calculation for Europe, and the number is actually, the corresponding number is 8. So the potential for the European economy, because of the composition of our economy, because we're relatively well advanced in terms of adopting digital technology and we have the infrastructure in place, the scale and the potential for Europe is actually bigger than the global average. And very briefly, the impact is composed of 3 components. The majority of the impact comes from most workers working together with generative AI tools that will help them be more productive at work. That's the main effect. There's a lot of small applications for a lot of people in a lot of different jobs. That's the main effect. A lot of little things that adds up to a big aggregate impact of productivity that helps us be better at what we do at work. Part of the things that generative AI can do is it can help us do stuff without us needing to care about it. It can do work instead of us. It can free up time. And that's the second component. It's that component of it. But it's the smaller share of the potential as we see it. So we leave the machine to do some of the least value creating things, some of the least complicated stuff in our work, such that we can free up time to do something more creative, more value creating with that time. So the machine create the value that we created before, such that we can do other stuff with our time that we are better at than the machine. That's that part. Then for certain jobs, and I'll show you that in a minute, if you dissect sort of the composition of the European workforce, there are jobs that are highly exposed to generative AI, where more than 50% of the tasks that they carry out at work today can potentially, over a time frame of 20 to 25 years, can be automated with generative AI. So there are a certain number of jobs that are at risk of being, changed so much by technology that they will need to find a new job. And of course, that is an important feature to factor in. And we do that, and we assume that you cannot just shift from one job to another job without that having an impact on the productivity level. So that's the deduction that we make in the calculation. So that's embedded in it. Now, I'll spend just a very brief to talk about how do we then decompose the impacts of the workforce. Because you may have seen numbers which are the average aggregate effect, that around 20% can be used by generative AI, or 20%, some say then 20% of jobs. But I would argue that's the wrong way to think about it, because the picture looks more like this, and we're simplifying because we have millions and millions of different kinds of jobs. But broadly speaking, we have a third of our workforce that are doing jobs where generative AI is likely to have very little impact. They are still around. And that's actually around a third of the workforce. Then we have the majority, and that's perhaps forgotten a lot, is jobs where generative AI can do a little to help us become more productive and free up a little bit of time, but it'll not change and overhaul our job, but it'll help us improve and free up a bit of time. That's the massive, and that's the majority of the impact. So when you break it down into assessing the details of what share of the workload of different types of occupations, and this is using like a long list of 900 different occupations, and looking at 40 different generic tasks that you do at work, and how workers are dividing their time according to those tasks, and assessing that the cognitive task with a difficulty level of 4 out of 7 can potentially, over 25 years, be assisted with generative AI. That's the level of details that is built into it, comparing it then to the composition of the workforce according to all those occupations. And this is then sort of summing all of that up. And our conclusion is just there is 20% of time at work that can be freed, but it's very unevenly distributed. A lot of folks won't feel it that much. And then there's 7% for whom more than 50% or 50% or more of the tasks they do today could potentially, over 25 years, be carried out by computers. Now, that's a lot of jobs, but when you contrast it to the churn that happens in the economy all the time, it isn't an alarming number. Europe is capable of creating new jobs at a speed that is much bigger than this churn. So over that long period of time, it's not alarming, but it's something that we need to take account of. Breaking it then down by sectors, generative AI is very different from past rounds of technology. It can address productivity and services. So 80% of the potential are in service industries. We point to 2 risks in the study. One, that we get delayed. The cost of being 5-year delayed is a drop from an 8% impetus to a 2% impetus, a 5-year delay, because the adoption period is so short and it'll peak in only 10 years. So time is really, really short to capture the benefits of this. We only have 10 years. It's like a second. So that's risk number one. We are too slow and missing the curve, like we did the last time around with the internet economy. The second risk, and it is important, but I'm less concerned because we know how to do this. But if we fail on reskilling and upskilling our workforce, it is really, really not good for these persons. So we definitely, just for human reasons, need to do it, but it's also bad for the economy. So if we miss out on the reskilling, it takes a lot off the potential. So reskilling is also an important part of it. European workers are actually some of them more optimistic about the impacts. And workers that tried and have worked with generative AI are actually more optimistic than those that haven't. So that's a positive. Now, pointing a little bit to the negative before finishing, the long-term drivers of the parameters that will drive the innovation that is needed to capture the full benefits of generative AI, Europe isn't ready for it. And Draghi put it very bluntly in his report. I can highly recommend it. And he said Europe needs to radically change to improve, in particularly on the bottom part, which are the more fundamental drivers of getting the innovation benefits of this new technology. So in the report, there are 5 sets of recommendations, and the report is out there. I invite you to go and take a look. And thank you for listening. Have a good rest of the day.
United in diversity. We are very heterogeneous in our opinion.
If we do not renew our partnerships with the rest of the world, Europe will not be relevant.
We can make it if we are together as Europeans.
Do you genuinely believe that countries will manage to reach these very ambitious targets?